Hello and welcome to Lecture 10 on Shakespeare's Hamlet. Today let's turn to Act 4 in the play, and specifically to Act 4, Scene 3. I'm on page 1462 in your anthologies. And let's begin near the top of the page at line 16. Recall here in Act 4, Scene 3, Hamlet has murdered Polonius and he has hidden the body. And here in this scene, he has been forcibly brought by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern before King Claudius. And Claudius wishes to know where Polonius is. The king says at line 16, "Now, Hamlet, where's Polonius?" And look at Hamlet's response here, "At supper." And the king, not understanding Hamlet, "At supper? Where?" And Hamlet retorts, "Not where he eats, but where he is eaten." And again, here we see that Hamlet appears not to have any remorse, any regrets for having killed Claudius. He doesn't appear to be contrite here. And in fact, he's making a joke. He's jesting with the king. And he says, "Not where he eats, but where he is eaten. A certain convocation of politic worms are eaten at him." So he's attacking Polonius here. Politic worms. Remember that word politic here. It's referring indirectly, he's attacking Polonius. Polonius was a political man. Polonius was a schemer, a meddler, an intruding fool, and deserved, in the end, he deserved his fate. He deserved being killed by Hamlet. But the worms here, they are politic worms. They too are schemers. And in the end, Polonius is no match for the politic worms. A certain convocation of politic worms are even at him. Hamlet continues here, "Your worm is your only emperor for diet." Notice the word emperor here. The worms of the earth rule the planet. They're the only emperor for feeding, for diet. We fat all creatures else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots. Your fat king and your lean beggar is but variable service. Two dishes, but to one table. That's the end. So Hamlet again, here he is attacking Polonius, and he's also attacking the king, your fat king. He's reminding Claudius that he too is destined to be eaten by worms. He too is no match for the emperor worms, the politic worms. But Hamlet is also, I would argue, attacking the comic narrative that many humans uphold. The idea that our stories end happily, and that in the end that life is essentially good, and despite the suffering and the pain that life entails, that life is essentially good, and therefore it should be promoted, it should be continued. Here, no, this is not the case. Hamlet is presenting the tragic narrative of the human story, isn't he? The Last Supper. This is the Last Supper. The Last Supper each of us will be present at is not the supper where we're sitting down to eat, but where we are being eaten. We are being consumed by the worms. So this tragic ending here is how each of us, uh, where each of us will find it's a catastrophic ending for each of us, isn't it? Dying and ultimately death and being consumed by worms. Your fat king and your lean beggar, whether you be the fat king or the lean beggar, it's but variable service. Two dishes, but to one table. That's the end. Um, Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, that this idea of the tragic view, the tragic story, uh, that it's a world where humans feed on one another, actually, not literally, but figuratively. You have a fat king here, and you have the lean beggar, and you can't have one without the other. We consume, we're takers. It's built into us, evolutionary organisms. We spend our lives consuming. And we live on an island planet, so our resources are limited. So ultimately, as consumers, we are parasites. Uh, we're parasitic. We feed off one another. There's only so much pie to go around, and the fat king who takes more of his share, he leaves the lean beggar. There can't be winners without losers in this tragic story here, the fat king and the lean beggar. Um, and as I said, as consumers, we're addicted. We're addicted to life. Life is of projected value. Uh, it's basically an escape, an attempt to escape these states of dissatisfaction. That is the reason why we consume, why we take. And so it is an addiction. Life is an addiction, and all in the name of ultimately reproducing so that the cycle of consumption can begin again. That's what Hamlet, I believe, is saying here. And it all ends and it all begins again. The fat king. And he's talking directly, he's ridiculing Claudius. He's attacking Claudius here with the idea of the fat king. But I think Shakespeare, or the play at least, is also speaking to us sitting in the audience, those of us in the audience who are comfortable and smug with our lives and not realizing that each of us is a kind of king or queen in our own little kingdoms. And as long as we're content, as long as we're happy, as long as we're satisfied, then the fact that there are lean beggars in the world around us, it it's not of great significance for many, many people. It's not of uh, much importance, is it? Um, so the fat king and the lean beggar. You simply can't escape the fact that as long as there are human beings on the planet, as long as there are consumers, there will be those who will lack and who will not have their share of the pie. You have the lean beggars here. Um, Shakespeare, as I said, is speaking perhaps to us. Perhaps this idea of the king is a metaphor for you and me sitting in the audience, reminding us of this fact, of this brutal truth. Hamlet is sort of assuming the role here of the court fool, isn't he? I mean, he is under the guise of madness. He's put on his antic disposition. And if you recall, the court fool has the license to speak to the king, to speak the truth, the tragic truth, and to remind the king, to remind those people in power that they too, in the end, are ultimately subject to a tragic end, that they are not somehow divorced or removed from the suffering and the harm that inevitably everyone will experience. And so Shakespeare's play itself, Shakespeare has an artistic license, doesn't he? And he's speaking to us in the audience. We are the kings and the queens sitting in the audience. And Shakespeare's reminding us of the lean beggar here, the fat kings and the lean beggars, and ultimately, invariably, what their fates will be, where they will end. The Last Supper here. All humans are food for worms, if you will. We are no match for worms. Um, so Shakespeare's play itself is a kind of court fool, the licensed fool. Shakespeare has the artistic license, doesn't he? And he's trying to speak the truth to those of us in the audience. we recall Hamlet's famous words at the end of his third soliloquy: "The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." And Shakespeare's play, the play Hamlet, the play, art is the thing in which I'll attempt to catch the conscience of the king, of you and me sitting in the audience, of enlightening us, of giving us a more accurate understanding of who we are and where we are, of the reality around us, so that we can be better prepared. We can begin to think rationally, to use our brains, and to be rational and reasonable, and to try to come to an understanding of how to use our intelligence so that we can uh, know how to function in the world, and ultimately how to behave, how we need to learn what our limitations are. We can't all be fat kings. We can't all be takers and consumers. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. So we have the licensed fool, the court fool, who assumes the role of truth teller. He speaks directly to the king. And Hamlet here is taking on this role under his mask of madness. He is speaking the truth here. Um, and then we have Shakespeare, Shakespeare's play with its artistic license as well. So it's interesting here that, well, Hamlet, if you think about it though, Hamlet, he's really simply focusing on the absurdity, the ridiculousness of this vicious, this brutal cycle of consumption and addiction, and the notion that we can't seem to escape from it. But he seems to overlook, doesn't he, here? Hamlet seems to be overlooking what is of most value, and that is suffering itself. As I've said earlier in the play, particularly in the to be or not to be soliloquy, Hamlet he has moments because he's suffering from depression. He does have moments where he does uh, have a clear picture of uh, what is most important: the pain, the harm, the suffering that existence entails. That's part and parcel of living, of being. Um, but ultimately, I would argue, in the end, it's about Hamlet's suffering, his own pain. That's what he's primarily focused on. His ego doesn't allow him to to be rational, does it? To think about the suffering and the harm that he's causing. I mean, here he is uh, mocking Polonius, and he forgets that he killed Polonius, and that Polonius did not die instantly. We hear Polonius cry out from behind the arras, behind the curtain. Polonius cries out, "Oh, I am slain." So we can imagine that the last few moments of Polonius's life, of his existence, they may have been excruciatingly painful, and Hamlet doesn't seem to be cognizant of that fact, does he? He doesn't seem to be aware of the suffering that he caused Polonius. Um, Nor does he seem to reflect upon the suffering that he's going to cause Polonius's children, Laertes, and particularly Ophelia. I mean, we see in Act 4 that Ophelia, uh, when she hears that Hamlet, the man she was in love with, or I should say perhaps that the man she romantically desired, that when she hears that Hamlet murdered her father, um, she she's unable to um, process that information, isn't she? I mean, she descends into madness. She undergoes a kind of, well, she undergoes a psychological break with reality. And she suffers greatly. She suffers profoundly. She's deeply, deeply grieved over what has occurred, and it causes her to lose her rational faculties. So Hamlet isn't. I mean, Hamlet. Yes, Hamlet is he is underscoring the absurdity here in this passage and the meaninglessness of the cycle, the continuance of the cycle. But he doesn't seem to grasp what is of most value here concerning the tragic narrative that we discussed, and that is that suffering is of most value. So, yes, he is assuming the role of the court fool, the licensed fool, but he isn't understanding fully himself, is he? He himself is a kind of fool, a kind of fat king who can't see beyond his own needs and his own wants. Um, and so, continuing, uh, the king responds to Hamlet's words with "Alas, alas," again reminding us that Hamlet is feigning madness here. This is pretense to some extent, of course. Hamlet believes what he's saying here. And then Hamlet responds with a tongue twister, doesn't he? A man may fish with the worm that hath ate of the king, and eat of the fish that hath fed of that worm. Here we have Shakespeare, or Hamlet rather, uh, speaking a tongue twister. I've actually seen a few Hamlets on the stage fluff this line because it is a rather difficult line. But if you think about it, a man may fish with the worm that hath ate of a king, and eat of the fish that hath fed of that worm. What Hamlet's saying here is that the worm, remember the emperor worm, uh, feeds off the dead body of the king. And then the fish eats the worm. So the fish feeds off the worm. And then the man, the lean beggar, I suppose, feeds off the fish. And so by proxy here, right, the lean beggar is feeding off of the king. And ultimately, the king passes through the guts of the beggar. Look what Hamlet says here. The king again doesn't understand what Hamlet is saying here. Hamlet says, a man may fish the worm that hath ate of a king, and eat of the fish that hath fed of that worm. And the king says, what dost thou mean by this? And Hamlet responds, nothing, but to show you how a king may go a progress through the guts of a beggar. So the worm feeds off the king, the worm eats the king, the fish eats the worm, the beggar eats the fish, and then the beggar, uh, the waste material that the beggar excretes is the king and the worm and the fish. Uh, so ultimately, all of us are excreted as waste material. It's a fascinating tongue twister here, isn't it? Because it's really the realist would argue that the tongue twister here is really presenting us with an accurate picture of the biosphere, the planet we inhabit. The biosphere can't exist without living organisms feeding off of it. And so we do become parasites. We are parasitic. We feed off each other. Um, it's the only way for it to function. The only way for life to continue is to feed off the dead, if you will. I mean, we're all comprised of the dead. It's difficult to see, uh, but if you think of the billions upon billions of organisms that have lived on the planet before us, that have come before us, and who are now dead, we're feeding off uh, those organisms that are now dead. And this brings us back to the philosophical argument of antinatalism. Remember, the antinatalist argues that what is of most value in the world is human suffering, human pain, and that suffering is, in fact, uh, the only real value, as opposed to existence, which has projected value only. Uh, Someone with a comic understanding of the human story might say, yes, but uh, existence, suffering is necessary if we are to continue to exist, if we're continue to inhabit the planet, continue to live. And uh, the realist would ask simply, well, why is it that we need to exist? Why do human beings need to continue to exist in the world? If basically we are simply consuming, we're consumers, we're born in these as conscious sentient organisms, we're born to consume. We're born in these states of dissatisfaction, these states of need, these biological drives we have, and then of course with our psychological egos, our desires and our wants, and then we're born in particular cultures, and so we are indoctrinated and become addicted to particular dependencies that the culture subscribes to. So if we're consuming and we have to consume off each other, if you can't have, I mean, it's a zero sum game. You can't have winners without having losers in this particular game called existence, called life. And if we're consumers, if we have the need to feed and we're addicted from birth, and if this consumption is parasitic in nature, then why do we need to continue this existence? Why continue reproducing? Why is it that life has real value? Why does the human species need to continue to exist? This is the argument that the realist, who has this tragic understanding of the story, would argue. Why do we have this particular need to exist? After all, remember, there aren't any Martians. The Martians are non existent, and the universe doesn't seem to be particularly concerned about the non existence of Martians, does it? So, are human beings somehow indispensable to the universe? And the realists would argue our species will one day become extinct. We will no longer exist, and we certainly won't be missed any more than the Martians are missed. None of us here thinks very often about the non-existent Martians. None of us sheds a tear for the non-existent Martians. So why is it that the human species needs to exist? Why does it need to continue? Why, in other words, does life have a real value? The realist would say, no, it doesn't. That it simply has projected value. That it's something we're addicted to because it's what pain and suffering is what motivates us. It gets us out of the bed in the morning. We get out of bed to satisfy our needs and our wants and our drives. And when if certain needs are met, new needs take their place. So it's a continuous cycle. So the pronatalist would have to, with this comic understanding of the pronatalist who endorses this comic view, this comic narrative unfolding, would have to respond to this question: why is it that human beings need to continue existing on the planet? But there's also, interestingly enough, this passage here, again, I would argue that Hamlet is focused only on the absurdity of this cycle. It just keeps repeating this cycle of consumption and addiction and parasitism. And then it leads to reproduction, and then the cycle begins again. And this is what Hamlet is focused on here in this planet. All right, Hamlet believes it's simply absurd what's going on here. A man may fish with a worm that hath ate of a king, and eat of the fish that hath fed of that worm. And also, and this means that the king goes a process through the guts of a beggar, and the cycle begins again. But Hamlet is again focused only on the absurdity, the ridiculousness, the seeming, the meaninglessness of this, and he isn't focused on the harm, the suffering that this cycle, that is part and parcel of this cycle. You can't have the cycle, the circle of life. You can't have the circle of life without this circle of pain and suffering. Um, it's a zero sum game. But there is another philosophical argument here that is raised called ethylism. And the ethylist would contend that the antinatalist argument is correct, but it goes only so far. It's only concerned with the human story, with human existence. And Hamlet doesn't seem to I mean, in the to be or not to be soliloquy, he certainly reflects on human existence, but he doesn't seem to hear the pain and suffering that comes with human existence. But here he doesn't seem to be focusing on that. And he doesn't seem to be focusing on the worm that's being eaten by the fish and the fish that's being eaten by the beggar. So he's not focusing on the other species, the other organisms on the planet. And we're just the human species, just a small fraction of the other species on the numbers, the billions of other living, feeling organisms on the planet. And if you include the insects, and I would argue that, you know, what could possibly motivate insects to eat or to drink or to engage in sex if it weren't this need, this state of dissatisfaction? So I would imagine they too can suffer. So if you include the insects in this picture, in the list of all the other organisms, in addition to the human species, all the other species on the planet, we're talking about trillions and trillions of organisms. The ethicists would claim that these organisms are just, their suffering has just as much value as human beings' suffering. That for a human being to think that his suffering is more important, that that's a bias. He's prejudiced because he's human. So naturally, he sees his species as the species that matters most. That this is known as speciesism. And the ethicists would argue that these other organisms, rationally speaking, logically speaking, their brain states, when their brains are in pain, they are suffering just as human beings are suffering. Some scientists even make the argument that perhaps animals actually suffer more than human beings do, because perhaps our senses, a great deal of our neural network is engaged in doing this conceptual thinking. So perhaps our senses have been dulled because of that. But at any rate, the ethicists would claim that the antinatalist is romanticized nature, that believes that the natural world we should uh, we should simply let it be. The ethicist claims that the antinatalist thinks that it's perfectly all right for the human species to cease procreating and ultimately to become extinct, but to leave behind the other organisms on the planet that are trapped in their situation, in this cycle of suffering, that to do so would be irrational and therefore unethical. That the animals don't have our ability to reason. They don't realize that they're caught in this trap, this brutal cycle of pain and suffering. And recall that 80 to 90% of all the species on the planet, outside of human beings, we've managed to lower the numbers, lower the percentages. But 80 to 90% of all the other organisms on the planet, they are brutally killed before they reach the age of maturity, before they reproduce. 80 to 90% children. The children in the children of the other species are brutally killed. Many of them die in horrific ways. There's many of them are eaten alive by other predators, and then of course you think of the natural diseases and the natural disasters. And if an animal gets harmed in the wild, there's no ambulance to come rush it to a hospital, no doctors and nurses or attendants. So if an animal is injured, becomes hurt in the wild, it becomes a victim, an easy prey for predators. So yes, the enormity of the horror of the pain and suffering that these other organisms are experiencing is unimaginable, argues the ethicist. So the ethicist says that the antinatalist needs to have a realistic understanding of nature and not to somehow romanticize it, imagine it as being as and imagine the other organisms living a happy existence out there, that they're struggling every day just to survive, just to avoid pain. Um, and so the ethicist would say it isn't enough that the human species cease to procreate to end human suffering, but that the plan is that as the human species dwindles in population, that the final caretakers, after however long it would take, say 1 to 300 years, that the final caretakers on the planet, using the scientific knowledge that we've gained and the technological advances that we've made, the final caretakers of the planet, the final humans, should take control, and they should end all existence, all life on the planet quickly and painlessly, so that these organisms, these other conscious feeling beings, don't remain caught, trapped in this unending cycle of horrific suffering. So this would make a interesting essay, I think, for option C, for those of you, again, who enjoy writing argumentative essays. And again, you could use this play as a kind of springboard into your argument. And you could argue either the antinatalist argument, the philosophical position of the antinatalist, or you could argue the philosophical argument of ethylism, for ethylism. Um, and of course, you can either agree or disagree. And let's do some extra credit for this too, shall we? So I've already given you the extra credit work for the antinatalist argument. You can either agree with the argument, in which case you can have a conversation with someone and record that conversation. That's worth an extra credit point. Or you can counter argue the antinatalist position. Um, and in addition, have a conversation with someone. So total of 3 extra credit points for the antinatalist position. You can do the same with the ethicist position. If you wish to argue, counter argue the philosophical argument, you can certainly do that. Um, that's worth an extra credit point. Or if you agree with the argument, you can have a conversation with someone, or you could counter argue and have a conversation. So 3 extra credit points there. There's a total of 6 extra credit points. Some of you were concerned after your midterm scores, so here's a way that you can add points to your score. And why not? Let's have another extra credit point. Of these 2 arguments, the antinatalist position and the ethicist position, which one do you think is sound? Which one is correct? Because they can't both be sound. They can't both be correct. Remember, the ethicist claims the antinatalist vision is myopic. It's human-centered. It's it's it isn't broad enough. It isn't inclusive enough. It's not looking at all of the organisms on the planet that have brains and therefore can feel pain. And remember the ethicist, remember the antinatalist and the ethicist and the realist, of course, argues that a brain in pain is a brain in pain. And the only reason we have a think that our suffering is more important is because we are bigoted. We are prejudiced. It matters more to us. But rationally speaking, so that's our psychology, right? Getting in the way of our being rational. But rationally speaking, the realist would say, no, it doesn't really matter. It's the same brain state. And that all of these other animals, all of these other beings are living these value rich experiences and attempting to avoid harm. So, of these two arguments, which do you think is, which one do you believe is sound? There's an extra credit point. So if you make, or, well, no, I've already given the others if you don't think either one is sound. But if you think that one of these two is sound, which one? And explain why. So 7 extra credit points. And now let's return to the text. So, where were we? Yes, at line 32, Polonius asks again, where is Polonius? And Hamlet responds, in heaven. Send thither to see. If your messenger find him not there, seek him in the other place yourself. Uh, of course, here we see Hamlet giving Claudius an impossible task to seek for Polonius's soul in heaven. And if he doesn't find Polonius's soul in heaven, then Claudius can seek for it for Polonius's soul, his spirit, in the other place. And once again, Hamlet is constantly thinking not only of the reward, uh, the heavenly paradise, but he's also imagining the hellish punishment, isn't he? He never thinks of heaven without also reminding us there's also a Christian hell here. Is this a moment where Hamlet is once again questioning his faith? You might be able to interpret that way, I think, because of the lines he says next. Look what he says next. Um, but I forgot to mention, yes, he tells Claudius to seek for Polonius in the other place yourself. In other words, again, he's attacking Claudius here, telling Claudius that Claudius is destined ultimately uh, for an eternity of fire and brimstone in the Christian hell. And here Hamlet says, but if indeed you find him not within this month, uh, if you find him not within this month, you shall nose him as you go up the stairs into the lobby. So again, Hamlet being really callous here, not appreciating the harm that he caused Polonius and the harm that he causes Laertes, Polonius' son, and particularly Ophelia, Polonius' daughter. So, but anyway, he's having fun at Claudius and Polonius's expense here, and he's not aware, I think, I would argue, of the seriousness of his actions, of what he has done. But let us move on to the end of Act 4. And I'm in Act 4, Scene 4, and I'm on page 1464, the next page in your anthology here. And here, Hamlet is being escorted by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He's being escorted to the seaport to be sent packing. He's sailing off to England. Remember, Claudius is sending Hamlet to England. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are accompanying Hamlet. They will be going with him on the journey. And as Hamlet and his friends or his former friends are um, traveling, they come across Fortinbras, young Prince Fortinbras, the Prince of Norway, and Fortinbras's army. And Fortinbras and his army are marching to Poland, and they are going to attack the Poles. They wish to conquer a piece of land in Poland. And Hamlet sees the army marching past, and he asks the captain of the army. He wants to know what's happening here, and we get the story that Fortinbras is going to attack the Poles, and that the Poles are going to be fighting uh, the Norwegians for this plot of land. Um, and recall Fortinbras's story very quickly. Uh, Remember, Fortinbras's father, the king of Norway, was defeated and killed in hand-to-hand battle with the elder King Hamlet, Hamlet's father. And what we have here is young Fortinbras, the Prince of Norway. He's seeking revenge. Originally he wants to march against Denmark, and he raises an army to do so. But then the uncle of Fortinbras's uncle, now the king of Norway, learns of Fortinbras's desires, his desire to revenge himself for his father's death. He wants to, in other words, Fortinbras wants to, through revenge, wants to reestablish the family name of Norway. He wants to restore pride to the family name. Remember, this is the cult of martial honor, martial military honor. And for the military man, revenge is seen as an ennobling act, as I said earlier. It's the means by which one can restore pride, or reputation, honor to the family name. And Fortinbras is a military man. He's been raised in the Norwegian culture, which subscribes to this particular cultural code. And remember, this cultural code of military honor, it welcomes warfare. It wants a battle because the battleground is a testing ground where men of military prowess and strength and courage, where they can exhibit their skills and make a name for themselves, establish a reputation, earn the name. Remember, the highest virtue for the military man is courage. It's what makes a man, it's what makes him honorable. It's the immortality project for the military man, isn't it? To establish a name and to be remembered after his death. And so this is Fortinbras's original plans was to attack Denmark, but his uncle discovers this and uh, uh, refuses to allow his nephew Fortinbras to march on Denmark, but instead gives him permission to march on Poland. And Claudius also gives Fortinbras permission in attacking Poland to march through Denmark because Denmark, right, is between Norway and Poland. So Claudius has given permission for Fortinbras to march his army through Denmark so that Fortinbras and the Norwegian army can attack the Poles. And Hamlet sees the army marching, and he speaks with the captain, and he learns that the little ground, the plot of land that the two enemies are battling over is has no value. It's a small plot of absolutely no worth, no value, can't be farmed. can't be used in any way. It has no productive value. And Hamlet, at first, can't imagine then why these two armies would be warring over it. And he tells Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, after the captain exits the stage, Hamlet tells Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to go before him. So Hamlet he's left alone on stage to speak his seventh and final soliloquy. And it's on page 1464, beginning at line 30. When I by the way, when I discussed the prayer scene, that was Hamlet's sixth soliloquy, by the way. The soliloquy, remember, that begins now when he comes across Claudius, now might I do it, Pat, now he is a praying, and now I'll do it. And he raises his sword. That's his sixth soliloquy. I don't know if I mentioned that in my last lecture, but this is his seventh and final soliloquy. And it begins with the lines at line 31 or so. How all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. So he sees this prince marching, the head of an army, and they're off to do battle to restore the family honor. And each of these men fighting in the battle wishes to make a reputation for himself, each of these military men. And Hamlet, you can see the predominant feeling he's experiencing here. He's ashamed of himself. All occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. So here again, Hamlet is berating himself. He's disgusting with himself for not having uh, 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 taken action, for not having killed his uncle, not having revenged his father. And here he is once more, just denouncing himself, attacking himself. And he asks the question, what is a man? There's the question. What is a man? If his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed. If a man simply spends his life, his existence, sleeping and feeding, if that is all he does, then he's no better than a beast, right? Hamlet says he is a beast no more. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast no more. He's simply an animal because animals, of course, spend their time sleeping, feeding. So a man would be no more than an animal. And of course, we have to remember sleep and feed both. I would suggest that you could think of these words as figuratively. The idea of to sleep here figuratively suggesting not thinking, not using one's brains, not being rational, remaining in a state of ignorance. Animals are, for the most part, generally speaking, in a state of ignorance. They have some abilities to reason. They can learn, obviously, the reward and punishment system, right, that's built into their brains, part of their evolutionary process. So they can, to some extent, reason, but for the most part, they are ignorant and they are, in that sense, asleep. And a man who doesn't use his intelligence is asleep in that sense. And this idea of feed, again, you could think of this word feed in a figurative sense too. If a man is simply someone who spends his existence taking, feeding, uh, grabbing, like the man of political ambition, um, the taker, the grabber, the man, the self-interested man, the man who is concerned only for himself, only to feed his own needs, then he is a beast no more. He is living his life like an animal. He's not using his intelligence. He's not being irrational, and he's being unethical as well, isn't he? What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast no more. And then Hamlet thinks of his God. Sure he, the Christian God, sure he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. So remember, Hamlet is a Christian. He's a Christian prince. He believes in the Christian God. And remember, the Christian God is a creator God, a God who created the universe. That, for Hamlet, explains the origins of human beings here on earth. The Christian God, and he created man, especially man, the paragon of animals. Man is of all the creations. Man was created. Hamlet believes that man was created in the image of the Christian God. And man, therefore, was given this ability by his God to reason, to use his rational faculties. And Hamlet says, um, sure he that made us with such large discourse, this ability to conceptualize, to, to reason, looking before and after, okay? This idea again of being able to use our potential, our rational capabilities, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. So he gave us this ability to reason so that we would use it. We would use our intelligence so that we would know how to govern ourselves and what to do with our lives. Now, and then Hamlet says next, now, whether it be bestial oblivion or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event. So Hamlet's now wondering, why hasn't he acted? Why hasn't he used his intelligence? His God gave him this intelligence and he's failed to use it. Is it because he's been asleep, and been only concerned about his own needs and wants rather than taking revenge and for the dishonor that his father received at the hands of Claudius when his father was murdered? Why hasn't Hamlet acted here? Has he been asleep? Has he been only concerned about his own wants, his own needs? Has he been behaving like an animal? Is it bestial oblivion? Or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event? That's interesting. He says this line here. And I think this is where Hamlet is thinking. Uh, he's misguided here. He begins to think irrationally here because, yes, Hamlet does quite a bit of thinking in this play. We'll grant him that, won't we? I mean, we catch him often in the play philosophizing and reflecting and thinking, and he has his notebook and he journals and he observes and so forth. But thinking too precisely on the event, on this idea, the event for Hamlet, of course, being the act of revenge. I would argue that yes, Hamlet does quite a bit of thinking, but it isn't precise thinking. It isn't accurate thinking that he does. Um, it isn't. He doesn't. It isn't factual. It isn't. It isn't precise. It's not that he's thinking too precisely. It's that he's not thinking precisely enough. That has been Hamlet's problem. And remember what's been getting in his way: his psychological ego, his needs, what he wants. He's in pain. He's suffering. He wants to take revenge. He loved his father. He idealized his father. He desires. It's his ego, what matters to him, what's important to him. So it's his culture that's indoctrinated him to hold these particular codes, right? The cultural code of military honor, for example. He's never challenged this code. He's never thought about it in depth. He's never questioned it. He's been raised to believe in it. His father subscribed to it. And he does like daddy tells him, does like daddy does. So he doesn't challenge these authority figures. Now, this would make a really interesting essay to look at the authority figures in Hamlet's life, the father figures in Hamlet's life. You could look at his heavenly father, the Christian God. You could look at his earthly father, the elder King Hamlet. You could even look at his stepfather, the surrogate father, Claudius. What are these father figures doing in this play? How are they how do they figure into the play? What is it the play is saying? What is the play, do you think, is saying about these three authority figures, these father figures? Do you think the play is somehow supporting this idea of an authority figure? Someone who gives you commands, someone who gives you the law and you don't question it, you simply obey, you don't challenge it? Or do you think that the play is undermining this idea of a moral authority, this authority figure, particularly a male authority figure? Remember the fathers here. It's a male, it's a patriarchal world we find ourselves in. What is the play saying? And you could look at these three authority figures. At any rate, um, Hamlet doesn't challenge these cultural codes. You could argue that he's been brainwashed to believe in them. He doesn't challenge the cultural code of military honor. He doesn't challenge the cultural code of Christianity. He doesn't question it openly and directly and honestly. He accepts it. You can see at the subconscious level he's struggling with contradictions, not only between these codes, but within these codes, within the Christian code in particular. The cultural code of personal ambition. Now, this one he challenges. This one he despises this idea of the political man, the man interested in acquiring material wealth and gain and so forth, and power, and wanting that privilege, and wanting that authority and that rule. Claudius, Polonius, these are the political men, the schemers. They are men of personal ambition. Hamlet does challenge this role openly, but let's recall that in order to kill Claudius, he has to behave like a personally ambitious man. He has to do it on the sly. He has to do it behind the closed door, a knife in the back. He looks like the politically ambitious man with his sword raised above Claudius's head during the prayer scene. So he may openly, consciously, uh, challenge this particular code. But subconsciously, he appears to be subscribing to it. And he even admits several times in the play that he is an ambitious man. There's a part of Hamlet, I would argue, that wants to be king. It's his opportunity to become, right, to establish his name, to follow in the footsteps of his father, to immortalize himself. It had been his immortality project. And there are moments when he actually does confess, and moments when he's, berating himself, uh, attacking himself, that he does confess that he's an ambitious man. Um, so he doesn't challenge these codes. So Hamlet has not been thinking too precisely upon this particular event, his particular circumstance or situation. I would argue that he's not thinking precisely at all, for the most part, other than that passage in the to be or not to be soliloquy, where he's reflecting upon the suffering that human beings experience and that how life and suffering go hand in hand. But other than that, he is controlled by his psychology and by his culture and even by his biological drives, as we saw in the closet scene with Gertrude. We talked about Hamlet's problems with sexuality and at the subconscious level that he is actually jealous of Claudius, longs to, he actually has these feelings, he has these sexual sexual desires and these lustful feelings, but he can't act on them. He represses them. So this is a man who is controlled by his psychology. He is controlled by his biology. He is being controlled by his culture. And he's not thinking rationally. He's not thinking too precisely. He's not thinking precisely enough. That's the problem here. And he says, now, whether it be bestial oblivion or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quartered hath but one part wisdom, and ever three parts coward. So again, you can see here his emotions. He's just said that it's important to use one's reason. And here he's saying thinking too precisely is only one part wisdom and his three parts coward. So you can see here again his emotions rising to the surface, and he's really angry with himself for not having acted. So you can see his psychology taking over again in those lines. He says, I do not know why yet I live to say this things to do. That is this the seeking revenge. This things to do. Sith I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. So he says everything's at his disposal here, and he has the strength, and he has the desire, and he has the cause. So why hasn't he acted? And then he looks at Fortinbras and the army, the Norwegian army marching by, and he points to this, and he says, "These examples, gross as earth, exhort me." Right? They they reveal that I must be a coward. I'm three-quarters coward here because it's just as large as the earth itself. These examples before me, they're as great, as large as the earth itself. How can you miss these examples? Examples gross as earth, exhort me. Witness this army of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, whose spirit with divine ambition puffed, makes mouths at the invisible event, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare. So he admires, in one sense, he admires Fortinbras because Fortinbras is a man of ambition. He's seeking to restore, in this sense, he's seeking to go into battle and to confront death, to confront danger. Um, and he he isn't afraid. He makes mouths at the invisible event, the future outcome here. He's exposing his own life, and he's unsure of what will happen and all that death and danger dare. And he's doing it even for an eggshell. Now, this is interesting here, isn't it? Because on the one hand, he seems to be saying that Fortinbras is someone to be admired because Hamlet is aware, seems to be admired for his taking this act, uh, trying to, the military man. But on the other hand, this idea that there is a kind of irrationality here, isn't there? Because he's doing all this even for an eggshell. Look at the metaphor eggshell. An eggshell is something that you toss away. Generally speaking, it's of no use. And this plot of land that the two armies are fighting for is of no value. It is of no use. And yet they're willing to risk their lives. They're willing to endanger themselves, to risk harm in the name of reputation, in the name of honor. So Hamlet, again, if I can get this out correctly, he admires this drive to establish this honorable reputation. He's right. He's upholding this idea of military martial and military honor, even though he can see that Fortinbras ultimately, in the end, is fighting for an eggshell, for something that is of no value, of no worth. And he says next, look what he says next. Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honor's at the stake. And there again, the metaphor of a straw. Again, a piece of straw, seemingly worthless, of no value. But no one should fight over a straw. But if honor is at the stake, if honor is what is being fought, if one is fighting over the piece of straw, not for the piece of straw itself, but rather to establish a name for oneself, a reputation. And in this case, Fortinbras wanting to restore the family name, the name of Fortinbras of Norway, then you can see that Hamlet, on the one hand, he admires this, but on the other hand, he can still see that it's irrational, it's absurd. And then Hamlet compares Fortinbras's situation to Hamlet's own. He says, "How stand I then that have a father killed, a mother stained?" So his father has been killed, his mother has been stained. Call the incestuous relationship. How stand I then that have a father killed, a father that has been killed, a mother stained, a mother that has been stained? Excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep. So he hasn't done a thing, whereas Fortinbras is marching toward revenge, toward restoration of honor. And Hamlet has let all sleep. So you can see the dominant emotion here, the predominant emotion here is one of shame, guilt. And look what he says next. He lets all sleep, while to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds. So again, see this conflict here. On the one hand, Hamlet admires what he sees here. And on the other hand, he sees just how absurd, how ridiculous their behavior is, because this fantasy, this trick of fame, they're marching for fame, for glory, for reputation, and it's a fantasy. He sees that it's a fantasy, but what he does believe is that honor is what matters. That ultimately, this idea of what it means to be honorable, that is what makes the man here. And I would argue too that Fortinbras's situation does not parallel Hamlet's. Remember, Hamlet can't challenge Claudius on the battlefield to restore the family name of Hamlet. He can't accuse Claudius before the court of having killed his father. I mean, what's his argument? A ghost told me so? And remember, the ghost only spoke to Hamlet. The meeting between the ghost and Hamlet was a private meeting. It was a private conference. So if Hamlet were to challenge Claudius openly on the battlefield, he would have to, what's his reasoning behind that? Challenging Claudius. So Hamlet does have to resort to becoming a schemer, a political man. He does have to do it behind closed doors, that dagger in the back. And then, two, think about it. Fortinbras, as the man of martial and military honor, remember Pyrrhus, the avenger. Pyrrhus is only concerned with the physical body of King Priam, only destroying that, killing that. And so with Fortinbras, he's only interested in defeating the Poles. He doesn't have to. Hamlet, on the other hand, remember Hamlet during the prayer scene. Hamlet can't be concerned with uh, killing Claudius's body only. Hamlet, being a Christian, believing in a soul, believing in a heaven, a Christian heaven and a Christian hell, has to also concern himself with Claudius's soul. And we argued that it was one of the causal factors that causes him to delay in that scene, in the prayer scene. The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law, the law of retaliation. Hamlet can't take the chance, can't risk that in killing Claudius at that moment, while Claudius is on his knees in prayer, praying to his God for forgiveness, that Claudius might be forgiven, might show himself to be a man of faith who is truly repentant, and therefore be forgiven. When Hamlet kills him, Claudius then would ascend into heaven. And remember, Hamlet would rather see his worst enemy in heaven than to have seen the day his father died, and certainly than to have seen the day that his uncle, the murderer himself. Remember, Hamlet thinks Claudius is the murderer. He can't know. We know, but he can't. But to imagine Claudius, his worst enemy, in heaven, while his father, according to the ghost, remember, the father, the ghost of supposedly the ghost of Hamlet's father, is claiming to be in this purgatory. That to Hamlet would be intolerable. So their situations are not similar if you think about it here. Anyway, How stand I then that have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep, while to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds. Look at that simile. They go to their graves like beds. They don't understand that what they're doing is ultimately irrational. Uh, it's not as if they're going off to sleep. They're marching into battle. They can be seriously harmed and they can be killed. And they're going to their graves as if they were going to their beds, but in the name of honor. So you've got, again, this conflict. On the one hand, it appears to be irrational, absurd, just on the surface, utterly ridiculous. It's all a fantasy, all a trick of fate. They're going to their graves like beds. But on the other hand, Hamlet keeps reminding himself they're quarreling over this straw, right? Because honor is at stake. They're fighting for this tiny plot of land because they Fortinbras and the Norwegians, want to reestablish their military greatness because they were defeated, remember, by Denmark, by the elderly king, Hamlet. They fight for a plot whereon the numbers cannot try the cause. Here's the irony here. The plot itself of land they're fighting for. Imagine all the soldiers, both on the side of the Poles and on the side of the Norwegians. That the plot isn't large enough to try for them all to fight upon. The little ground that they're fighting for isn't large enough to contain both armies. The Poles, too, they are men of military honor. They have to defend their land. It's all about their name, their honor, their reputation as well. And yet the ground they're fighting for isn't large enough for the battle itself, for the battle to be fought upon. Nor, look what he says at the top of the next page, nor is this little plot of ground which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. Look at that irony, an even deeper irony. The plot of land that they're fighting for isn't large enough to bury them all. And Hamlet imagines, he's 20,000 men here. I think he's exaggerating, isn't he? I thought it was 2,000 men. But in Hamlet's mind, you can imagine he's really stirred and excited, and it underscores the irony in the situation. And he imagines that there wouldn't be a continent large enough to bury all these men, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. And look what he concludes in the end. Oh, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. Look how he concludes there. A thought, the final thought here. For him, a thought is worthless. Thoughts are worthless if they are not thoughts of blood. If they aren't thoughts of blood, then the thoughts are worthless. My thoughts be bloody or be nothing worse. This is how he concludes here. This is not the man of reason, is it? This is the man of blood. This is Hamlet once again, trapped by his psychology, by his needs. This is the man of blood. Look at how he concludes. And he concludes with an exclamation point, too. He's that exclamation point. It underscores how sure he is, how certain he is that this now is the right course of action to take to revenge himself. And he will no longer think. He will no longer pause to consider the event. He exclaims at the end, which underscores his determination, his certainty, his surety that it's the correct course to take, the course of blood. That's what he says. And he exclaims it at the end, doesn't he? At the very end. This is how these lines should be read. Oh, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. They should be exclaimed this way so that we understand just who this man is at this moment. This is a man. Be gone.